Okay, in our second session, what I want to do is kind of stick to the notion of, in a broad sense, of consumption and leisure time. But I want to speak more specifically about cinema and about movies. And I just want to give a very sort of cursory overview of some of the key movements in Eastern and Central European cinema, how they came about, what was the political and the historical context, and maybe give you a few sort of names of some of the sort of the most pioneering and the most kind of interesting and the most classic examples of cinema from this period. There may be some names that some of you recognize, but there may not be, which is also fine. You don't have to be sort of knowledgeable about Eastern European cinema for the time being, but there may be also some examples of films that people would become interested in watching, and I hope that you do actually. After this lecture or at some point in the module, go and check out some of the films that we're discussing today, and of course every now and then there is somebody who becomes interested in writing a project on cinema and writing a project on movies in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and that's also completely fine. So I mean, if there's something that really sparks interest in this session, then by all means. Contact me and we can start talking about how this might become a more fully fledged project. That's completely fine. Now, the discussion of cinema, of course, is inseparable from a larger discussion about artistic expression and the arts under communism. And as some of you will know, at least a little bit, know a little bit about this. The approach to the approach to art, the approach to sort of cinema, to theatre plays, to literature, to poetry, to television later on, in the communist societies was a bit different. At different times from what it was in the West. In the West, we sort of, generally speaking, we despite what some people might claim, by and large, there is a sense of sort of artistic, freedom of expression and freedom to express oneself artistically. There are, strictly speaking, not really, that there aren't clear sort of censorship restrictions or very, very large kind of censorship restrictions. I mean, because there has been in the past, hasn't there? Infamously in Catholic Ireland, for example. But generally speaking, you can pretty much say most things in Central in Western Europe. There are other restrictions, of course. Movies and much art. But particularly movies is sort of subordinated, isn't it, to sort of commercial interests, and there are people who would complain that the films that we watch today are basically driven by market forces, and they're just sort of movies that are profitable and movies that make money, but not always of the highest artistic quality. And those sorts of arguments and those sorts of discussions were also had in the Cold War. So if we sort of pivot back to Central and Eastern Europe for a moment, on the one hand, and again it depends on the period that we're talking about, and I'll talk a little bit about the periodization in a moment. But on the one hand, because cinema was completely nationalized, the studios, the production, everything was sort of funded and was supported by the state. It meant that in most cases, commercial interests were not present. Films were not about making money. They were about other things. They were about a kind of artistic expression. They were very often about propaganda. They were about transmitting a political message. They were also often about entertaining people, but very often they weren't driven, as they were in the West, by market forces and by commercial interests. On the other hand, because the state was funding, and because the state, particularly in the early days, had a very clear idea about what people should watch and the kind of art that people should consume, The movies that were made, there was a much larger level of sort of control and censorship and prescription over the kind of things that people saw in cinemas. And if you're a filmmaker, a director, or a screenwriter, or somebody involved in the production of movies under communist Eastern Europe, these were the kinds of things that you would have to sort of think about. These were the kinds of restrictions that would be imposed upon you from without. Now, like I say, there are different phases. Now, if we come back to the initial phase, the phase of building socialism, we're moving now to slide number 2. In the early days, first of all, cinema was very new in Central and Eastern Europe. There was minimal in the interwar period in Central and Eastern Europe, and minimal movie production. In countries like Albania, there simply weren't any. I think there was one film. In Yugoslavia, there were very few in the interwar period. One of the few exceptions was Czechoslovakia. They had the great Barrandov film studios, and there was a greater sort of production of movies. But generally speaking, there were very few. So cinema was a very new form of artistic expression. It was a very new thing. In the post-war period. Now, it was also something that the communists immediately realized and immediately knew could be a very potent political tool. If we think back to what I've talked about in the last session and the last week, that this was a period where the communists were attempting to create a new society, instill in people new values, instill in people new ideas, build a new political system, and sweep away the failed political systems of the past. In order to achieve this, the communists realized that cinema was a very powerful way of communicating their message, that it could be used for political means. They could show stories, they could show cinema that would uplift people, that would communicate to people the sort of the policies and the direction that people wanted the state to take. Now, it was a lesson that they had learned from the Soviet Union in the 1930s under Stalin. Stalin also, on the one hand, was a great cinema buff, loved film, just like Hitler. And on the other hand, understood that communicating the Soviet message, the message of Stalinism to the masses, was something that cinema could do very effectively. It could reach the parts that other places couldn't reach. That it could achieve things, that novels or the newspapers could not do. I mean, it was a much more powerful, visceral, something that the people experienced on an emotional level, something that people were fascinated by, just as they are to a great extent today as well. So the state took control, nationalized this part of the economy, just as it nationalized every other part of the economy, but understood that film production was something which could now be put in the service of the political revolution, the communist revolution that the new governments were attempting to achieve. Now, just like in all other forms of artistic expression, the mode of storytelling, the kind of film that was produced was heavily prescribed. I'm talking about the very early period, the period of Stalin. So from the 1945, the end of the Second World War, up until the sort of mid 1950s, the period immediately after the death of Stalin. The model of filmmaking, the kind of films that were produced and that were made and were screened in the period, in the initial period of the socialist regime, were really very much cut from the same cloth. Those were stories that communicated the ideals of the regime, that told stories that were linked to the war, that were linked to industrialization. They could be love stories, they could be heroic stories, but ultimately it was always cut from the same genre, cut from the same mold. And the mold of filmmaking was known as socialist realism. Now, this may be a term that some of you have heard before, and it may be a term that people have not heard. Depending on where you come from. But essentially, socialist realism, the contours the way of telling socialist realist stories was set out by a Soviet minister, a man called Andrei Zhdanov. And he worked under Stalinism. He was one of Stalin's ministers. He was his culture czar, if you like. He was the person who was in charge of cultural affairs. And he prescribed the way culture should be produced and the way culture should be communicated. And according to Zhdanov, the purpose of culture, the purpose of cinema, but also the purpose of novels and of short stories and of poems was to teach to the people in a very straightforward way, to show the world what the world looked like, to show sort of socialist values and to show how socialist values could be achieved and could be realized. So the stories would, there was no surrealism, there was no Dadaism, there was very rarely at this stage science fiction, there was no magic, there was no anything like this. The stories had to be realistic, they had to be based in real life, but they had to show to the people the real life would be improved and the real life would be transformed through the socialist revolution and through the achievement of socialist goals. This was socialist realism, realistic, the realist genre, but one which indicated to people how they could move forward through the socialist revolution. Now, I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, then we can certainly... I mean, it is something that I think I will bring up when we discuss this in one of our Wednesday sessions. We can talk a little bit about socialist realism, and if there's anything that's unclear, we can go through this and discussing at greater length what exactly what is involved with socialist realism. But essentially, those are the foundational principles. Now, it isn't necessarily a bad genre, and there are actually, God help me for saying this, but there are actually some very good films based in this socialist realist model. It's a very simple way of telling stories, and in this is a sense, this was in a sense something that the communists believed was a democratic way of telling stories. They felt that things like avant-garde and surrealism and symbolism, as fine as they may be, were simply too elitist. They would be things that the average peasant working in Ukraine or Central Asia would never be able to understand. They needed a much more simple way of telling stories. The problem with socialist realism is that it was the only show in town, and it throttled any other kind of artistic expression. It was not conducive towards creating more interesting stories, and this I think was became part of the problem. So, like I say, what kind of films were being watched? Well, they very often had to do with things like industrialization, things like collectivization. What one person disparagingly called these. The socialist realist genre is boy meets tractor, boy falls in love with tractor, boy and tractor live happily ever after. That they were set on the collective farms. Very often they were set in the war, and they would show how the Communist Party behaved very heroically during the war and achieved a communist revolution. So simple stories, realistically told, but always extolling the virtues of early communist society. So collectivization, industrialization, stories about the war, stories which showed the communists as the great heroes, and the various collaborating groups as the great villains. And this form of this form of storytelling, under these nationalized, state-funded and state-controlled national cinema production houses and studios, was pretty much the story that was told throughout the Eastern Bloc, in Poland, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, more or less in the first decade after the communist revolutions, after the Second World War. Socialist realist stories were the only show in town. These were the only things people could watch. And again, it was not just in movies, it was also in the literature of the time, it was also in the poetry. There was a strong sense that just as people were building new buildings and new bridges and new tunnels, and just as people were constructing the infrastructure of socialism, so the art of the time would need to direct the average person towards a better socialist, a better socialist future. Now, there was an outlier, and again, it's the one that usually outlies. If we turn to slide number 4, this is Yugoslavia. Now, at least initially in Tito's state in Yugoslavia, in the period up until the break, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, which took place in 1948, the break between Stalin and Tito, Yugoslav cinema and Yugoslav art was also restricted to this socialist realist model. And one of the finest examples of this is a film, pretty much the first film in post-war communist Yugoslavia, a film called Slavica. And it is about a young woman who fights for the partisans and she sees her joining the partisans and fighting, and so on and so forth. It's not a bad movie. It's a very it's an early war film, but it is a film that I have some kind of affection for, and it is very interesting to see that in this film, at least, in Slavica, the hero is actually a heroine. Slavica is a woman's name, and Slavica is indeed the hero of this story. So that's quite typical of Yugoslav socialist realism in its early phases. They were promoting and pushing forward the notion that women were an active part of the partisan struggle, which to a certain extent they were. Played an active role and were an active role in communist society going forward. So it's almost a sort of early example of socialist feminism, which makes it kind of quite an interesting and unusual film. Now, when Yugoslavia broke from the bloc, they also broke from the norms of Stalinist society, which means they also broke, not just in the economy, not just in politics, but also in culture. And what that meant was they also broke from socialist realism. In trying to forge their own path, the Yugoslavs decided that they would also forge their own path artistically, that they would not restrict themselves to socialist realism, but instead they would look for other sort of modes, and that they would do other interesting things in the cinematic arts. Now, the great sort of architect, the great hero, the great sort of director of this new departure in artistic expression is a Croat author whose picture I've placed there, a person called Miroslav Krleža, a Croat author. Krleža had been a member of the Communist Party since the 1920s. He'd been a very early person who joined early the communist revolution, and he had stuck by it right up until the 1940s, a close friend of Tito. But he was also a very highly respected novelist, author, writer, playwright. Krleža was kind of given the role of redirecting Yugoslav art away from socialist realism and towards something that would be uniquely Yugoslav and something would be much more liberated and much less restricted. So this upheld throughout the arts, in literature, in poetry, in painting, but also in cinema. And what this meant, though, was from a very early stage, Yugoslav cinema, just like Yugoslav socialism, completely state-controlled, but nevertheless directors and screenwriters had much more freedom over the stories they told. They were not restricted to the socialist realist model. They could do things that at this early stage people elsewhere were not able to do. Now, if we come back to the rest of the bloc, leaving aside Yugoslavia for a few moments, once again, the trajectory, the changes in cinema coincided with the changes in the political world, roughly coincided with the changes in the political world. Now, we've seen that after the death of Stalin, there were changes in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the rest of the bloc. There were changes in the economy. There were changes throughout society, and sometimes they were not as far-reaching as people would have hoped. But nevertheless, from the 1950s onwards, there was a brief spell of a new direction. This also happened in movie making in the rest of the bloc, in places like Poland, in places like Hungary, countries which had been very restricted in terms of the movies that they made and the movies that they showed. The death of Stalin introduced a short-lived thaw in the arts as well. So not just in economy, not just in politics, but also in the way movies were made. Now, at this early stage, the most interesting departure took place in Poland. This is on slide number 6. From 1956 to 1963, in wake of the new changes that had taken place, in wake of the death of Stalin, in wake of the new relationship that Poland had with the rest of, with the Soviet Union, but also the new relationship that the Communist Party in Poland was attempting to forge with the Polish people. This also manifested itself in the kind of films that were made. Now, there was a spate of very talented filmmakers who were active and who were making films from 1956 to 1963. Films, that challenged the dogma, challenged the orthodoxies of socialist realism, films that asserted a Polish national character, films that revisited the history of the Second World War, challenged a lot of the orthodoxies that the communists had imposed upon Polish society at the end of the Second World War. So movies now, having been subordinated and having been put at the disposal of the communist regime and the Communist Party up until this stage, were now being reapplied, were now being retaken by Polish filmmakers to start to sort of challenge the dogmas and challenge the orthodoxies of the previous periods. Now, two of the stalwarts, two of the most interesting people involved in this were the director Andrzej Wajda and the actor, a guy called Zbigniew Cybulski. And Wajda became, and up until his death, which was relatively recent, sort of about 10 years ago, Wajda became one of the key figures, not just in Polish cinema, but he would go on to become one of the great, directors in world cinema. And some of his best films are considered to be some of the best films that were produced in Eastern and Central Europe since the end of the Second World War. And Zbigniew Cybulski was his kind of Robert De Niro or his James Dean, the actor that he kept working with, that he kept using. Very charismatic, very good, a great actor, somebody who is extremely popular still in contemporary Poland. Now, the great film, there are many great films that Wajda made, but I think one of the most interesting ones for our purposes is a film called Ashes and Diamonds. It was produced in 1958. Now, you may remember that we talked about the novel Ashes and Diamonds a few weeks ago when we talked about Czesław Miłosz. I told you how in Czesław Miłosz's book, The Captive Mind, he introduced 4 people: Alpha, Beta, Omega, and Delta. Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. That being the Greek alphabet. These were 4 people that he knew during the Second World War, and all 4 people who initially, at least, became interested in communism. Now, Alpha was an author, a novelist called Andrzejewski. And Andrzejewski had written a novel called Ashes and Diamonds. It had been published in immediately after the end of the Second World War in 1948. And in 1958, Wajda made a film of it starring Cybulski, and it has become one of the great war films, one of the great Eastern European war films since of the post-war period. It's a very good film. It deals with Cybulski plays a veteran of the Home Army, so of the Polish national resistance, who has been given the task of assassinating a communist politician, which is not unusual not unusual task for Home Army soldiers to carry out. He shoots the wrong person. Actually, it's at the beginning of the film. They assassinate the wrong person. There's a muddle up with the intelligence, and as a result of this, his handlers tell him to lie low in this hotel for the night. Until they can work out where they're going to go next and what they're going to do and how they're going to sort of cope with this accidental killing. So the film takes place over one night, and Cybulski undergoes this incredible sort of redemption. He falls in love. He thinks about the war. He thinks about the future. He thinks about all kinds of things. Other people staying in this hotel are representatives of various parts of Polish society at the time. There is a clip that I've put up. It's very sentimental, but it is quite affecting. And this is an image of the Cybulski character thinking about what he's done during the Second World War and listening to a very patriotic Polish song that's being sung by this nightclub singer and cabaret singer, and lighting, in the best Polish tradition, lighting brandy in memory of all of the people that have died during the Second World War. And the influence, the inference here is that he fought during the war for the Home Army, and most of his friends have been killed. Now, what the other thing that's very interesting about Ashes and Diamonds is to make a comparison between the film and the novel. In the novel, Andrzejewski really shows a cross-section of Polish society. There are various families. The story is constructed around various families in Poland, some of whose members are supporting the communists, some of whom are supporting the Home Army, some of whom have really done nothing during the Second World War and have essentially sort of laid low. And essentially what Andrzejewski is trying to say is that Polish society at this time is deeply divided. Fathers against sons, brothers against brothers, sisters against sisters, sisters against mothers, daughters against mothers, and the picture is extremely complicated. In Wajda's film, it's much more straightforward. It's very clearly a positive reappraisal of the Home Army, and it's very critical of the Communist Party. The communist apparatchiks, the communist functionaries are depicted as very cynical figures. The Home Army is depicted as a group which has really sacrificed during the Second World War and has really suffered accordingly. So it kind of shows some of the trends that were taking place during this period of thaw, that increasingly the Home Army was being rehabilitated. The patriotic directors like Wajda and patriotic actors like Cybulski were sort of depicting the Home Army in a much more positive light and the Communist Party in a much more negative light. Anyway, if you get a chance to see this film, I urge you to do so because it's really one of the best Polish films. Cybulski sadly died quite young. And quite tragically, he died jumping onto a moving train, actually, in a provincial Polish station, and he slipped and he fell under the tracks and he was killed. What makes this doubly ironic is that this had been, in one of his films, his character did exactly this. He jumped onto a train to sort of leave behind his girlfriend or something like that. And so it's a tragic irony that in fact he life imitated art, and Cybulski died when he jumped on this train. But I mean, he was an incredible actor. Starred in many of Wajda's films and is an incredible. He's a lot like James Dean, that he's just this incredibly sort of big personality, and then big, or maybe like Marlon Brando in those early days. He really kind of, you simply can't take your eyes off him. He's just so sort of captivating. Okay, now moving on. That's the Polish school. The other, there's a couple of other movements that I want to talk about before I wrap up. Maybe three other movements. In slide number 8. We haven't talked too much about Czechoslovakia under communism yet, but we will do next week. But for the time being, just to give you a bit of a preview and a bit of context, de-Stalinization in Czechoslovakia took place belatedly. It didn't take place in the 1950s as it had done in Poland and Hungary. It kind of began in the middle of the 1960s. So all of the processes of relaxation, of economic transformation, of political transformation, took place in Czechoslovakia about a decade after they took place in other parts of the communist bloc. Now, what this, what accompanied this transformation is this great sort of artistic flourishing, this great sort of artistic revisitation, and this also was true in movie making. The Czechoslovak cinema experienced what is known as a new wave of filmmaking in the 1960s, an incredible burst of talented directors, men and women who really broke out of the socialist realist mode, broke out of the way that things had been prescribed to them by the communist regime, and really created a very interesting kind of cinema. Now, I don't know if these names will mean anything to you. The names of the movies like Loves of a Blonde, Report on the Party and the Guest, The Fireman's Ball, The Joke, The Cremator. I don't know if any of those mean anything to you, but tell me if they do in the discussion that we have later. Directors like Milos Forman, he would go on to direct, he would defect to Hollywood, and he would go on to direct films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Amadeus, The People vs. Larry Flint, the film with Jim Carrey about what's it called? Man on the Moon, I think it's called Man on the Moon. Anyway, he became a big noise in Hollywood. Directors like Vera Khaitilova, Jan Niemetz, Jiří Menzel. Like I say, it was part of this economic and political change that took place also in the country. Now, in slide number 9, Czechoslovak cinema experienced international accolade with 2 films that won the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. In 1965, a film called Shop on Main Street, and in 1967, a film called Closely Observed Trains. Both of these films are relatively easy to find and also very interesting. The Shop on Main Street is actually a Slovak film, and it's set during the Second World War, and it's about a man who is given, during the anti-Semitic rounding up and during the sort of the expulsion and the requisition of Jewish property, he finds himself, he gets the shop on Main Street, which had been owned by a Jewish shopkeeper, by a Jewish shopmaker. And the film, almost all of the film, takes place between these 2 characters, him and this Jewish shopwoman, in the shop itself. And it's a case of him attempting to explain to this very elderly, very sweet old woman that she no longer owns this shop, that it belongs to him now. And it's kind of a tragicomic film because she sort of recognizes him as a customer, doesn't understand what's going on, doesn't follow politics, doesn't know about the war, just wants to sell sweets. And this guy is trying to explain to her that he owns the shop now, and then that she must leave, and he's wrestling with his own conscience. And this is a very interesting film. The other film, Closely Observed Trains, won the Oscar in 1967. It's directed by Jiří Menzel, and it's set during the Second World War, and it's about a young guy's kind of sexual awakening. He gets caught up in the resistance, but he's basically about trying to sort of overcome his sort of sexual hang-ups and falling in love, and it's a very typically sort of Czech story. It's based on a novel by an author called Bohumil Hrabal. Now the new wave, the new wave films were very interesting, very experimental, very surreal. When you watch them collectively, they're a real break. You have to understand that this was an incredible sort of breath of fresh air after the very turgid and very prescriptive and very dogmatic movies of the socialist realist period. These directors were really trying to do something new, trying to do something interesting. They're trying to break out of the mold of the films of the past, and collectively these films are experienced as a breath of fresh air. So also a very interesting movement. Now, finally, the last movement that I wanted to talk about was in Yugoslavia. Again, I mentioned this is a slide number 10. This was, as I mentioned earlier, Yugoslavia had already been part of the artistic experimentation and artistic expression in Yugoslavia had already been more interesting than in other parts of the country, than in other parts of the bloc, because of Krleža, because of the way they broke away from the mold of socialist realism at a relatively early stage. But the other thing that's very interesting is that Yugoslavia, it was a socialist country, but because of the way the economy was organized, there were certain elements of what might be called private ownership, private profit, private enterprise. And this created some of the social problems that you would not see elsewhere in the socialist bloc that you would see in the capitalist bloc. So things like homelessness, things like joblessness, things like living on the poverty line. Now this was something that had not been seen, was not talked about publicly in Tito's Yugoslavia. But the filmmakers of the 1960s and the 1970s were particularly interested in looking at the margins of Yugoslav society and showing, if you like, the left behinds. So it's very similar to the kind of kitchen sink drama, the kitchen sink stories that you could have seen in places like Great Britain or in places like West Germany, where all of a sudden there's an interest in the underclasses, an interest in the people who are not benefiting from the economic system, from the social system. It's interesting that this would happen in a socialist society. Now there are two films by a very good. It was called The Black Wave, Crni val, in Serbo-Croat language, attempting to sort of show out the sort of the forgotten corners of Yugoslav society. Now, I've uploaded or I've put links to two very good films by a Yugoslav director called Jelimir Žilnik. Short films, personal favorites of mine, so I'm indulging myself. But it would be very interesting to hear what you think about these films. They're very short; they last like 10 or 15 minutes. And I would be intrigued to find out what you think of them. The first one is called The Black Film, and it's really one of the films that begins the Black Wave. It's set in Novi Sad, which is a city in the north of what is today Serbia, but what was then Yugoslavia. And in it's kind of a documentary almost, in which the director goes out onto the streets, picks up sort of 10 homeless guys, invites them back to his apartment where his wife with his young baby are living, lets them stay with him for a week or so whilst he goes out. His wife looks after them, and he goes out onto the streets and starts asking people, randomly, strangers on the streets of Novi Sad, what he should do about these people. And at the same time, cuts back and forth between his apartment and the streets, and he's interviewing these people. He just puts a mic in front of them, asks them what they think should be done, and really exposes the fact that people don't know about this homeless problem. They don't know what to do with it. And then at the same time, in his home life, we look at these homeless people, and we start to see that we hear their stories. We hear what they're doing. It's shot through with these ironic sort of revolutionary films, revolutionary songs, communist songs, rebel songs from Italy and from the communist movement, which sort of ironize the notion that communism is not delivering people out of poverty and delivering people out of hardship. It's very funny. It's very interesting. I would be, these old guys living at home is just absurd. But I would be very interested to hear what you think about that film. So please give it a watch if you get time. The other film is a more simple film called Inventory, and I'm not going to explain it. I think I'll explain it in our Wednesday session. But if you would just watch that, and just respond to it, and I'll tell you what's going on later. It would be interesting just to hear your spontaneous attitudes and your spontaneous views about this particular film. But again, it's very short. Okay, so what am I trying to say here? Well, two things really. Cinema was nationalized, and cinema was used as a very successfully used as a very powerful weapon of essentially propaganda by the communist states. They knew that this was a popular medium. They knew this was a medium that people were interested in. They knew this was a successful and effective way of communicating a political message to the masses throughout the country. So that was one element of cinema under communism, a very important one. On the other hand, as always, there are people who want to use artistic expression to challenge the ruling dogma and to challenge the orthodoxies, political, social, cultural, economic of the time. And people like Vaida, people like the Czechoslovak New Wave, people like the Yugoslav Black Wave, the directors, the actors, the screenwriters who were involved in those things did indeed use cinema to challenge. Now, it was very difficult, of course. In many cases, they were biting the hand that fed them. There was no private cinema. Everything was nationalized. You were very, it depended on how the regime felt at the time. In the 50s, maybe there was a thaw. In the 60s in Czechoslovakia. But at other times, for example, in the 80s in Poland, it was almost, or for that matter, in Czechoslovakia, it was almost impossible to make films that were critical of communism, to make films that were critical of the communist regime. Now, I've mentioned the great stars, the classics, but of course there was a lot of middlebrow kitsch as well, which is quite enjoyable in and of its own right. There are a lot of films that were just kind of soppy romantic comedies, musicals, very simple, unchallenging films that very many people liked, that did not rock the boat politically, but that people sort of, were interested in watching and interested in seeing, and found an audience, and the communist regimes liked them. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about late socialism in the coming weeks, and we'll talk about the 1970s and the 1980s. But for the time being, I would just say the following thing, that as communism sort of wound down, we're going to see later on that there was like I said in the last lecture, there was a crisis of legitimacy in late socialism, particularly in the 1980s. And in very many cases, the regimes were interested in trying to depoliticize people, trying to get them off the streets, trying to get them out of the unions, trying to get them out of political agitation, and trying to sort of just keep them at home, keep them quiet, keep people more or less satisfied. One of the ways they did this was to use culture, was to use simple-minded movies, musicals, this kind of thing, to sort of keep people in their front rooms, to keep people from protesting, to keep people from rebelling. So in late socialism, as we'll see in a couple of weeks' time, cinema became a tool through which this could be accomplished. But we will talk about that later, and I think that I am done for today. So thank you very much for listening.